Formula One, as with all motorsport, is defined by choices. Choices of car design, choices of strategy, but also choices of drivers and teams. Teams take risks by changing a familiar driver lineup. These can be a roaring success or a total failure. But teams aren't the only ones who make choices when it comes to driving. The luminary greats of the sport very often have no shortage of suitors when they do decide to move on, such that they essentially have the pick of the paddock and any team would happily accommodate them. Juan Manuel Fangio, despite being 45 years old, was one such man. Now a four-time world champion, he was to leave the Ferrari team with whom he had just won a third straight title. When a driver of such renown makes a move like this, it carries even more risk. You can either solidify or perhaps even grow your legacy with a move away, or you can watch your career completely implode, never to recover again. Fangio had taken this gamble on two occasions already in his career. First, when he moved from his Maserati drive to the incoming Works Mercedes team for 1954, a team that would bring him two of his four titles. Then, after Mercedes withdrew from the sport at the end of 1955, Fangio went to Ferrari, who had just acquired the chassis and assets of Lancia's failed team. Just as before, he tasted immediate success. Now he was taking another risk, moving from a team with an exceptional driver lineup and a good car to move back to Maserati, the team he had left in 1954. Now, they were no minnows, Stirling Moss had proved as much in 1956, but they were still using the same car as the one that Fangio had last driven in 1953. Even though it was heavily upgraded, it was an aging design. Even without Fangio, Ferrari still had a strong driver lineup. They had retained the trio of Peter Collins, Luigi Musso and Eugenio Castellotti. To replace the outgoing Fangio, they re-signed Mike Hawthorn after he had spent 2 seasons away from the team. Maserati meanwhile lost Stirling Moss to Vanwall, but at least had retained John Berra as well as adding Harry Schell, the latter whom had impressed with midfield performances the previous year. The main challenge to the two Italian giants would be the aforementioned privateer team Vanwall. They featured an all-British lineup of Stirling Moss, Tony Brooks, and later in the season, Stuart Lewis-Evans. The season was to consist of 7 non-Indy races. It was originally 10, but the Belgian, Spanish and Dutch Grand Prix were all cancelled due to the Suez Crisis. To make up for the shortage of rounds that were now on the calendar, a second Italian race was added in Pescara, around the public road course that made up the circuit for the 12 Hours of Pescara sports car race. Fangio was already a driver who had done things that no other driver had done before, but could he now become truly untouchable? My name is Synapse, and welcome back to F1 Retrospective. In the midsummer heat of Argentina, the teams prepared to start the season, and by teams I mean just Ferrari and Maserati. None of the British teams had made the trip to Argentina. As a result, Vanwall Stirling Moss was making a one-off appearance with Maserati. He would put his car on pole, over a second ahead of local hero Fangio. John Berra ensured that Maserati locked out the first row of the grid. Eugenio Castellotti was the highest placed Ferrari in fourth, followed by teammates Peter Collins, Luigi Musso and Mike Hawthorn. During the off-season, Ferrari had made extensive upgrades to what was the Lancia D50, and rechristened the car the Ferrari 801. On race day, these upgrades appeared to be a horrible error. 3 of the 4 works Ferraris would burn out their clutches before half-distance, while Castellotti also wouldn't make the flag. Meanwhile, the Maserati of Moss hadn't even got off the line. The throttle linkage had broken. He lost 10 laps getting it repaired, but did eventually get back in the race. All of these problems left Fangio and Berra to roar off into the distance. Fangio would take the checkered flag first, his 4th consecutive win at his home race. Berra followed him home in second, with local driver Carlos Menditegui completing the podium. Harry Schell made it a Maserati 1, 2, 3, 4. The best Ferrari could manage was a shared 5th place drive for Jose Froilan Gonzalez and Alfonso de Portago. Stirling Moss, although having his race ruined before even setting off, did at least manage to claim the fastest lap for himself. Ferrari couldn't have had a more dismal start to the season. While Maserati were enjoying success with an old but consistently updated car, Ferrari's desire to completely overhaul their car over just one winter had made the car less competitive. But for the prancing horse, things are about to get much worse. Eugenio Castellotti, despite his youth and having less F1 experience than some of his peers, was regarded by many as Italy's greatest driver and the heir to Alberto Ascari's throne, destined to one day be Italy's 3rd drivers' champion. He enjoyed celebrity status in his home country, not just due to his skill and well-renowned sophistication, but also due to his relationship with Italian ballerina and actress Delia Scala, who he'd just gotten engaged to at the time. On the 14th of March 1957, Castellotti arrived at the Modena Autodrome for a private test session in the Ferrari 801. Enzo Ferrari had reportedly told his driver in person to test there and to break a lap record that had recently been set by Maserati's Jean Behra. In his haste, he hit a curb at speed and was thrown almost 100 metres from the car, which overturned several times before coming to rest in a members' stand. Fortunately, no one else was hurt. Unfortunately, nothing could be done about Castellotti, with doctors concluding that a fractured skull had killed him instantly. He was just 26 years old, and Italy's wait for another world champion is still ongoing to this day. The Ferrari team still kept turning despite this tremendous loss, because for many, driving occupied the body while their minds figured out the rest. The week before the F1 season was due to resume in Monaco, the 1957 Mille Miglia was held. The Mille Miglia was a prestigious sports car race dating back to the 1920s, a colossal 1,000-mile circuit between Rome and Brescia, made up entirely of public roads. As a result, it was one of the most dangerous races in the world. Numerous F1 drivers competed at this event, Ferrari drivers being no exception. Alfonso de Portago had set off alongside his American navigator Edmund Nelson. Just 40 miles from the finish, his front tyre exploded. He lost control of the car, hit a telephone pole, and barreled into the spectators lining the road. The car then bounced back across the road through more spectators before ending up in a brook. In total, de Portago, his navigator, and 9 spectators lost their lives. The Spaniard's body was found near the car. It wasn't in one piece. 3 days after the race, the Italian government decreed the end of the Mille Miglia and banned all racing on public roads. In the space of just a couple of months, Ferrari had lost half of their core driver lineup. The Monaco Grand Prix, held just a week after de Portago's death, saw former Ferrari driver Maurice Trintignant return to the team with whom he had won this event in 1955. In addition, German driver Wolfgang von Trips was making just his third F1 start with the Scuderia. In qualifying, Fangio led the field by over half a second. Peter Collins' Ferrari was second, ahead of the 2 Van Walls of Moss and Tony Brooks. The top 5 was completed by Hawthorne's Ferrari. On race day, Moss got the jump on both Collins and Fangio, while the reigning champion dropped down to third, while Hawthorne passed Brooks. On lap 4, there was carnage coming out of the tunnel. Moss went straight on at the chicane, crashing and sending debris all over the track. Collins crashed in an attempt to avoid the wreckage, as did Hawthorne. Fangio and Brooks were able to slow and avoid having their race ended, although Brooks did pick up some minor damage from clipping Hawthorne. Fangio would hold the lead ahead of Brooks' damaged car. A race of attrition left Von Trips in a position to claim his first F1 podium until his engine gave up the ghost with just 9 laps to go. This meant third place was then inherited by Jack Brabham, only for his engine to cut out around Casino with only 5 laps to go. He was able to coast down the hill to the harbour before getting out of his car and pushing it home to finish 6th. Fangio won the race ahead of Brooks, those two being the only cars on the lead lap. In the end, the final podium place went to Maserati, driven by the American Maston Gregory on his F1 debut. Young British driver Stuart Lewis-Evans finished 4th, also on his F1 debut, ahead of the Works Ferrari of Maurice Trintignant in 5th. Much like the previous year, retirements and mechanical problems in the first 2 races for Moss were severely hindering his title aspirations, especially when Fangio had less competition and was driving better than ever. He now found himself 16 points in arrears to the Argentine master. Fangio himself led the standing by 11 points ahead of the pair of Behra and Brooks. The French Grand Prix had a new home for 1957, moving from the engine destroyer that was Reims to Rouen, which was regarded as a much more modern circuit than its predecessor. Fangio once again led the field in qualifying, this time by over a second ahead of teammate Behra. Luigi Musso was the highest placed Ferrari, Harry Schell made it 3 Maseratis in the top 4, while Collins lined up in 5th. Moss was absent from this race due to an illness. The race itself was yet another display of Fangio dominance. Musso initially jumped him off the line, but once El Maestro retook the lead after 4 laps, he never looked back and led to the flag, ultimately winning by over 50 seconds from the Ferrari of Musso. Musso would set the fastest lap in his attempt to keep up with Fangio. Collins rounded out the podium, and Hawthorne was 4th to round out a much-needed successful race for Ferrari, even if they didn't win. Harry Schell took the final points, albeit 7 laps down. A second-place finish meant Musso now jumped all the way up to 3rd in the standings. He was now Fangio's closest challenger, but that didn't really mean much. Fangio had now pulled out an advantage of 18 points over just 3 races. A 5th title looked to be his for the taking. The British Grand Prix once again alternated venues, moving back to Aintree. Qualifying was close, the top four separated by less than half a second, but in the end Moss took a third consecutive pole at his home event ahead of Bello and Brooks, with Fangio down in fourth. Hawthorn lined up fifth. Moss led off the line but eventually hit car troubles and began to drop back. His Vanwall teammate Brooks, meanwhile, was struggling. Just under a month prior he had sustained injuries after an accident at the 24 Hours of Le Mans and was clearly still not fully fit, so the decision was made to swap the drivers and put Moss in Brooks's healthier car. Brooks had to be lifted from the cockpit, unable to get out under his own power. Back on track, Bello led Fangio until the Argentine's engine blew on lap 49, a rare mechanical failure for Fangio. This left Bello heading for his first F1 win, but then on lap 69 his clutch gave out. Moss, who had been driving at a blistering pace since rejoining, inherited the lead and didn't look back for the remaining 20 laps. As a result, the two British drivers shared the points for their shared win, and it was also the first win for a British constructor, and to top it off, it was done by two British drivers on British soil. Musso finished second ahead of Hawthorn, making a return to the podium. Maurice Trintignant and Peter Collins shared driving duties for a fourth-place finish ahead of Roy Salvadori in fifth. Unlike other shared drives, Trintignant was awarded all the points and Collins was awarded none, as it was determined that since Collins only drove the last 3 laps of the race, he hadn't driven a significant enough distance to be awarded points. Fangio's non-score and Musso's second place helped narrow the gap at the top to 12 points, but you got the impression that this was too little too late, as Fangio was to have a chance to clinch the title at the next round in Germany. In an effort to increase participation, the race organisers at the Nürburgring allowed Formula 2 cars to run alongside the Formula 1 cars, a practice that would become common in the coming years at the Nürburgring. Those cars are shown in yellow. Fangio once again showed his mastery of this great circuit by taking pole ahead of Hawthorn. Bello was third, while the Brits of Collins and Brooks were a distant fourth and fifth. Prior to the race, Fangio had inspected the tyre selection and fuel levels of the Ferraris and observed that they were looking to run the whole race without making a pit stop. Therefore, Fangio opted for a softer tyre and a half tank of fuel. It meant he wouldn't have to make a pit stop, but he'd be able to drive much faster. He used this to his advantage and took an early lead, which he held until he came in for his pit stop on lap 13, 30 seconds ahead of Collins and Hawthorn. The pit stop was an unmitigated disaster. While changing one of the wheels, a wheel nut rolled under the car and Fangio lost half a minute while the crew tried to find it. He rejoined in third place, 48 seconds behind Collins and nearly a minute behind Hawthorn, with 10 laps to go. It looked hopeless, but Fangio didn't hear no bell, and set on one of the most remarkable charges in motorsport history. Over those 10 laps, Fangio broke his own lap record of the Nürburgring 9 times, including a streak of 7 consecutive lap records. He went over 8 seconds faster than his qualifying time, and was at one point 15 seconds a lap faster than Hawthorn. With just 2 laps to go, he caught and passed Collins, and later on the same lap, he made a daring pass on Hawthorn with 2 wheels on the grass. Hawthorn tried his best to fight back, and Fangio was never truly able to shake him off, even during this superhuman drive. But eventually he held on to the win by a little over 3 seconds, and in doing so would clinch his 5th world title in masterful style. At age 46, he would be the oldest champion in F1 history, and probably will be forevermore. After the race he said, "I have never driven that quickly before in my life, and I don't think I will ever be able to do it again." Musso's 4th place now meant that he couldn't catch Fangio in the standings, while Moss claimed the final points position for Vanwall. Hawthorn's 2nd place finish elevated him to 3rd in the standings to make it 2 Ferrari drivers in the top 3, despite none of their drivers winning a race all year. Later in life, Fangio commented, "The Nürburgring was my favourite track. I fell totally in love with it, and I believe that on that day in 1957, I finally managed to master it. It was as if I had screwed all the secrets out of it and got to know it once and for all. For 2 days I couldn't sleep, still making those leaps in the dark on those curves where I had never before had the courage to push things so far." Pescara was the round added to the calendar at short notice due to the cancellation of the Dutch, Belgian and Spanish Grand Prix earlier in the year. It is the longest circuit to ever host an F1 event, with one lap being almost 16 miles long. It had hosted sports car races annually since 1924. It was also extremely dangerous, even more so than the Nürburgring, consisting entirely of public roads winding through the Italian city of Pescara and the surrounding area. Now, I know I said earlier that the Italian government had banned road racing in the wake of the Mille Miglia, but this race was given special permission by the government to go ahead, after the organisers made minor modifications to the circuit layout. It was still a death trap, though. As a protest against the Italian government's desire to ban road racing, and due to the pending investigation of the Mille crash that left 13 people dead and that under Italian law he could have been found liable for manslaughter over, Enzo Ferrari declared that none of his cars would enter the race. One Ferrari driver did enter though, Luigi Musso, as an unofficial entry, reportedly after repeated pleas to Enzo to let him race. As a result, only the Maseratis, Van Walls and a pair of Coopers were in attendance. Fangio took pole over 10 seconds ahead of Moss, who in turn was the only other driver to set a lap time under 10 minutes. Musso was third in the sole Ferrari, while the Maseratis of Bello and Shell lined up fourth and fifth respectively. Race day was dry and very hot. Fangio had complained of pains in his shoulder, but still competed in the race. Musso initially led off the line, while Van Wall's challenge was hindered when Brooks retired on the first lap. Moss took the lead from Musso on lap 2, while Fangio ran in third. Behind them, the hot weather was beginning to thin out the field very quickly. Stuart Lewis Evans had lost a lap due to a tyre failure and Beira suffered an engine failure. They were joined on the sidelines on lap 10 when Musso's engine blew. The oil that spilt as a result caused Fangio to spin and damage a wheel. This left Moss out front with an unassailable lead. In fact, his lead was so great that he was even able to stop and top up both his and his car's fluids. A unique thing then happened when the Cooper of Jack Brabham was running short on fuel when he was on the back section of the course, far away from the pits, so he simply pulled into a roadside petrol station and filled up before going on his way. Moss won by over 3 minutes ahead of Fangio, having taken the fastest lap. American Harry Schell got a long-awaited F1 podium, while countryman Mastin Gregory finished fourth, while Lewis Evans recovered from his tyre blowout to finish fifth. Moss's win elevated him to second place in the standings in what was now a fight to be the best of the rest. For 1957, the Italian Grand Prix at Monza went back to only using the standard circuit layout, ditching the poorly constructed and dangerous banking that had been used previously. Ferrari returned after boycotting Pescara for this, the most important of Italian races. On this power-heavy circuit, it was to be a three-way fight between Ferrari, Maserati and Van Wall. The Van Walls looked to be the quickest as they took a 1-2-3 in qualifying, with the young Lewis Evans on pole ahead of Moss and Brooks. They were followed by a trio of Maseratis consisting of Fangio, Beira and Schell, while the four Ferraris were languishing in the middle of the pack. On race day, the Van Wall of Moss got the best start, while Beira moved up to second, with Lewis Evans and Brooks following behind, while Fangio then attached himself to the back of this 5-car train as they pulled away from the rest of the field. The early laps saw Moss and Beira trade the lead back and forth until Fangio hit the front on lap 7, only to then have the lead go back to Moss, then to Brooks, and then to Lewis Evans. All this in just the first 20 laps. On lap 20, Brooks dropped out of the fight with a sticking throttle. Later, Lewis Evans ran into engine troubles, and this left Moss in the lead with Fangio and Beira behind. But Beira was then forced into the pits for new tyres before his car then overheated shortly afterwards. What then followed was similar to Monaco, in many drivers inheriting third place but seemingly none of them wanting it. Schell was first, but he retired with an oil leak. This gave third to Collins, who then retired with engine failure. Next was Hawthorne, but a split fuel pipe in the closing laps relegated him to 6th, leaving third to eventually be claimed at the finish by German Wolfgang von Trips. Ahead, Moss held off Fangio for his third victory of the season, while Mastin Gregory finished 4th again, and a shared drive for 5th was split between Schell and Giorgio Scarlatti. Brooks took home the fastest lap point, even though he had finished several laps down. Oh yeah, and I've got some good news for you. After 1957, F1 stopped splitting points for shared drive, so no more of this nonsense. They did still continue with the only certain number of points scores count for the championship nonsense for a long while longer. This result saw Stirling Moss secure a runner-up in the standing spot for the 3rd year in a row. Perhaps next year would be his year, as it appeared Van Wall was starting to become a real threat to the manufacturer teams, but also because Fangio was calling time on his full-time racing career, and would only participate in selected races of 1958. He was truly in a class of one, the only man to win 5 titles into 2003, and his half-retirement would throw the field wide open. As Van Wall had done before them, another British privateer team would also begin their rise in 1958, a name that has since fallen into obscurity, only remembered by the select few die-hard fans, but a name whose mark on the sport can be found on every single F1 car ever made after this point. Until next time.